Thank you. So last week I was down in the United States at a meeting in New York and then in Orlando, and the meeting was an organization of sort of medical leaders of various universities, and I was the only Canadian there. And as doctors do when we're helping to run hospitals and clinics, there's all sorts of stress about various things going on in our healthcare system. And the only Canadian there, I felt, there were some American-type, healthcare issues going on, and everybody sort of talking about them in the press. And I thought the organizers did something really neat. At the end of the session, they passed around a microphone to everyone who was there. And the question that each one of us had to answer was, what keeps you up at night? And so the microphone was passed, and you can imagine, CEOs or presidents of hospitals or vice presidents of hospitals, it was the operating rooms aren't open long enough, our patients are waiting too long in the emergency rooms, the costs are going up about certain types of equipment, we can't find physicians or nurses to run things. And so the mic sort of went around and around, and then it came to me, again, the only Canadian in the room with all these American medical leaders. And I said, what's keeping me up at night is actually American news is keeping me up at night. and I said, really, over the last 2 years, I am not sleeping because I am addicted to American news. I'm so behind in my Netflix binge watching, I can't tell you how frustrating this is. As our moderator said, it's a difficult time in the world right now. And when we think about why this is a difficult time in the world, we also have to look at history. There's been a lot of times that have been difficult in the world, but why are we bringing all this attention now? And we think about things that have happened in the past. 6 million people were killed in the Holocaust. Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. Millions of African people were bought and sold as slaves and killed. Millions of indigenous people were oppressed and killed all over the world. In Rwanda, not that long ago, 1 million people were killed as part of an ethnic cleansing. In former Yugoslavia, there was major death and major trauma. So why is it now that we're alerted to this? Why are we talking about it now? I don't know if I've solved that or totally figured that out. I think part of it is the technology and the media right now. We see some of these events shortly after they happen, and sometimes while they're happening, we're there and it's in front of us. So I think the ability to understand and see and hear about the atrocities that are going on in the world makes us quiver, even though there were all these things that happened in the past. I have to admit that as a Canadian, there was a proud moment over the last couple of weeks where our Canadian leaders said, we will be a safe place for refugees. We will be a safe place for immigrants. We welcome immigrants. We welcome refugees. And, as a Canadian, you sort of stand up with your straight posture and you say, yeah, I'm proud to be Canadian, and you maybe put on another couple of Canadian pins and so forth. But it's not always been that way in Canada. We have a history that we always have to remember that we shouldn't be proud of. We had the history of the Chinese head tax. We had the history of the Japanese internment camps. We had the history of the Kamagata-Maru incident. We had the history of the Aboriginal residential schools. The Chinese head tax, as many of you know, was a fixed tax that was really meant to block Chinese people coming to Canada after the CPR, after the railway had been built. It was meant systematically to reduce the number of Chinese people that could come to Canada because they couldn't afford the head tax. The relocation of Japanese Canadians during World War II, they lost their jobs, they were moved out of universities, they were curfewed, they were moved physically, their families were disrupted. Recently, UBC did a bit of reconciliation around that and gave some of the people that were interned honorary degrees. The Kamagata-Maru incident, where people who came from India, there were 376 of them. This is in 1914, and there were a combination of Sikhs and Muslims and Hindus, and they were docked here in Vancouver. And the law at the time said that they couldn't come on board. In fact, out of the 376, we ultimately accepted 24, but the other 352 returned, and some of them returned to actually being shot and being killed. And that's interesting. You might say, well, okay, that was the policy of the day. We just couldn't accept Canadians. Sorry, we couldn't accept immigrants from overseas. So they didn't accept these 352, but in that same year and the year before, there were 400,000 that were accepted from Europe, right? Finally, Aboriginal residential schools, and we have Chief Robert Joseph here, and he's done a lot of work in this area and is really the expert on this. My only reason to raise it is we think about these events like the atrocities that happened with our residential schools and what happened to our Indigenous communities. But just remember that the last residential school was only closed in 1996. right, in Saskatchewan. So that wasn't that long ago. You know, they often say that you have to keep studying history so we make sure we don't repeat it. Yes, I'm proud to be a Canadian today for what we're saying at the national scene. That's fantastic. But we also need to remember that we have a past that we don't want to go back to, but remember that we did make some mistakes. I'm seeing a lot of people wearing pink t-shirts today. It is Pink Shirt Day, so thank you for all of you wearing them. I've got my pink shirt and my pink tie on. And when we think about being inclusive and respectful, you know, it sometimes starts right on that playground. It starts with the bullying and so forth. And what does that really mean? So thank you for recognizing that it's Pink Shirt Day today. So why should we welcome newcomers to Canada? Why is immigration important? Why should we, when newcomers come to Canada, why should we be inclusive? There's probably a few things, and I think the most obvious when we think about this is we think about the humanitarian aspects, right? We think that, of course, we need to do it. If somebody is in a country and they're suffering, whether they're suffering because of personal safety or they're suffering because of financial reasons, their health reasons, we want to be good citizens of this world and we want to accept them. Absolutely, and that's it. That's okay. So we do it for humanitarian reasons, and we do it because we're good citizens of the world, and that's fantastic. I'd like us to move past that. I'd like us to think about the other advantages of being a country that people want to come to. Firstly, the economic impact. You know, we do improve our workforce when people come here from other parts of the world. Despite the misconceptions, and you'll hear this for countries that are closing their borders, when we say the people that are coming, whether they're refugees or immigrants, they're taking jobs and there's going to be less jobs for the people that are already in Canada. It's not true. Is that, in fact, what it does is it helps the economy so much that more jobs are created. And in fact, the ones that actually come, they're not also, the other misconception is that they're unemployed, they're on our social nets, and they're costing our welfare system and so much more. The people that come are pretty hardworking. The stats actually show that most of them will get jobs and are in the workforce. The second misconception is that, well, that'll just mean that everybody's wages will stay low because these people will come in and they'll work for lower wages. The truth around that is that when new immigrants and new refugees come in, it sounds weird, but it actually ends up increasing everybody's wages because the economy does so well. And the last bit is when you think about immigrants and refugees, I'm I guess technically first generation because I was born in India, but I came when I was about a year old. So I sort of behave and think like a second generation because my first memories are in Canada, not in India. And so when I think about what that first generation does, the first generation comes here partly for themselves, but they really come for their children. The work ethic and the motivation of refugees and immigrants, and if you were to compare, and people have done these studies, they are at least matching in terms of educational and economic success with people that were born here, if not exceeding them. So these are hard people, working people, and that helps the economy. So that's the economic benefit. The social benefit, do we even need to be talking about this? Every wave of immigrants and refugees that have come in, new food that we've experienced in Canada because we've benefited from that, new types of music, different art, literature, entertainment. Our society socially is so much richer because of all the people that have come. How do you put a dollar value to that? I would dare you to go through a week in Vancouver and only eat one type of ethnic food. Like it's literally impossible, right? We have guests come over to our house sometimes, and it'll be a variety. Every night is something sort of different. And they said, "You are really Indian, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, we're Indian, but this is sort of our Indian food. It's everything." But just I'm picking on that, but I'm taking on food, but art and entertainment. It's just so diverse. So the economic benefits, the social benefits. I'm going to give you a third one to think about, and I think this gets lost in the media. I'm going to suggest to you that we need to think about the safety benefit. It has been shown that countries, when you either block people from entering from a certain group, certain faith group or certain ethnic group, or you let them in, but then you don't include them in what's going on in the country, that's actually unsafe. So when you think about terrorist organizations around the world and where do they do their recruiting, they do the recruiting from places where the young people and others don't feel included in the society of the country they've moved to, right? And they feel disenfranchised, they feel disillusioned, they feel like they're being cheated. They're likely to be the ones that may join some group and do some harm. If somebody has come here from another country and they're patriotically Canadian or they're patriotically American, how likely are they to hurt somebody else in Canada and somebody else in the US? So I would suggest countries, and this is particularly the European countries, some of them that really aren't including the waves of immigrants that are settling there, I think that's actually creating a safety problem. So our moderator asked us what to do, what can we all do to improve the situation for newcomers to Canada, and I'm glad to hear that we're going to have some next step action items towards later in the afternoon. But I do have some things that I'd like you to think about. First is that when there is a policy, a legislation, a law, some rule that somebody comes up with that is systematically discriminating against those that want to come to Canada, I think that as Canadians, we have a moral responsibility to challenge it. That means your public leaders, the protests, the rallies, the letter campaigns. I think we have a responsibility to speak up against that. That's at a system level. Then more individually, I think we need to also recognize our subconscious bias. That is that how do you interact with someone because of your own experience? And it's not a very good joke, but I'll share it. I often tell people, being white people don't have the monopoly on racism, or the other way, being not white doesn't mean I'm vaccinated against being racist. All of us have a subconscious bias, and all I mean by that is there's something operating back here that makes me see the world in a certain way. It makes me see women different than men. It makes me see a transgendered person versus someone else, someone of color, someone with a head covering, somebody who speaks with a certain accent. We all have that. What we need to do is make sure that when that's operating behind, that we bring it to the table and we actually address that. It's when it's operating subconscious that we end up making decisions that discriminate, are prejudicial, and hurt others. So think about your own subconscious bias. Next is reach beyond your community. This is hard, right? So when I'm walking across campuses, UBC, SFU, Langara, or I'm looking across the hospital cafeteria, or I'm on a bus, or I'm looking at the playground, it is really great, especially in British Columbia, to see diversity. There's people of different colors and languages and so forth. Look a little closer. Are they truly integrating? They may be, and that's fantastic. Or are they just in separate little cliques, right? The Korean kids are only with the Korean kids, the Indian kids are only with the Indian kids, the Chinese kids are with the Chinese kids and on. That's not the diversity I was hoping for. I was hoping for the diversity where people are actually interacting. And where does it work? Strangely, simply, maybe the soccer field, maybe a classroom. So think of that as in your own space. When you're interacting with people, who's your close knit? Are the people just like you? Are the people that have grown up like you? And I have to admit, it's a bit safer. When I was going to university, it'd be a natural tendency that I would hang out with kids that were also South Asian descent, because they would understand, he would understand, or she would understand what my parents and my upbringing is like, because theirs were probably similar. So there was some similarities, and yes, it was a bit easier. It does take a bit more effort, and you have to go outside your comfort zone. But think about how much richer it'll be if you do that. The other part is thinking that when you meet someone, always trying to connect with them to find something in common. It's really easy to see differences, but look for even one thing, and I try on every interaction to do that. And I can assure you that the commonalities, the things that are in common, will be a lot more than there are the differences. The differences are very superficial. They're things on the outside. But the other things that we care about, we all want, good lives for our family, we want good health, we want good food, we want good education. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of commonalities. And what I often say as a doctor is, I've looked inside and I can assure you that our blood's the same color. Lastly, and this has to do with some of the negativity that we're hearing in the world right now, what's our best, I'll use the word, weapon against that? Our best weapon against that ignorance, our best weapon against that hatred, is education. We need to befriend, I know it's going to be scary, we need to befriend the people with these views. We need to enlighten them, we need to educate them. It is really easy, and the tendency is to go into a cocoon and be safe, but we need to reach out to these people who have these views that are not enlightened, so that they can also improve their view of the world. I actually don't think they're happy being fair and being hateful and being hostile and being mean. I think that their life would be a lot happier if they actually did understand things in a different light. And I think it's our job, and that's the weapon that we have. That's the tool that we have to improve their thinking. I'm going to finish here with a little anecdote from my daughter. So we have 3 teenagers, and any of you are welcome to have them. Give them back. Give us them back when they're in their 20s. No, just kidding. Is that we have 3 teenagers, and their skin colors maybe the same as mine or a little bit darker. And our daughter would get kind of frustrated when people would keep saying, she was born in Canada, people would keep saying, where are you from? And as I said, I'm second generation, and her mom, my partner, is third generation. Her grandfather came and her dad to Canada in the early 1900s, and her father grew up here, and then she was born and raised in Victoria. So she has to say, you know, I'm sort of third generation on this side and fourth generation from my mom's side. And people say, no, but where are you from? Are you really Indian? Like what? And so she got quite frustrated, as teenagers often do. So when now somebody asks her, where are you from? She says, I'm from the Children's Hospital on Oak Street. And I guess my story there is, in the end, we have to remember that we all came from the same place. We came from our mothers. Thank you.